Artie, welcome. So this is a video to give you an overview of the expectations for the midterm exam. Let me first say that the expectations and the format of the midterm is going to be identical to the final exam. So important to keep in mind that once you have this kind of format under your belt, it's going to be exactly the same for the final exam, with the exception that the content of the exam obviously will be different. And I've mentioned already that the final exam is not going to be cumulative. It's going to simply be based on everything that we do after, the content that we cover after the midterm exam, right? Let me first say, what do you find in this folder? The first thing you're going to find is the Word document for the exam itself that consists of instructions in terms of what you're expected to do on the exam and how to do it, particularly dealing with issues of format, technical things with word processing, but also more specific things in terms of the writerly form or the literary form of your answers. And then after that, the questions themselves. So I'm going to go over in a moment, I'm going to go over both of those things. You're also going to find a rules for writing little blurb that I wrote up on writing in general, dealing with some key things to think about as you write that apply to this writing this exam, but also obviously apply to anything you write in general. And the rules I'm giving you are general enough to really be able to apply them to anything. The key thing is that what I'm looking for in your exam is, number one, the substance of your answer, but then also the clarity of your writing and the organization of your writing and the polish of your writing. So both, I'm looking for form and substance, or what we've called form and content, right? Then the last thing you'll find in this folder is a Turnitin link, which is where you will turn in your exam when you are finished, right? The key thing is, I'd like you to turn your final exam in a Word document, and it's really important that you follow the formatting rules that I'm going to give you, so please listen carefully. So those are the other three key elements that you're going to find, and once you look at this, I think most of this is going to be self-explanatory. And I think some of the questions might come about the specific questions that I'm being asked more than the format. Okay, so let's look at the exam, and I'll tell you what's going on here. So I've got a lot of rules here and a lot of specificity, but you see a lot of them start to be a little bit redundant, and I've broken this down into directions and grading rubric. Grading rubric gives you specifics, fine-grained detail on what I'm looking for in your exam and how you can expect to be graded, right? Obviously, once you take the exam and you have specific questions about why I've graded something the way I have, we can have that discussion through email. Also, I'll be giving you comments. So on one hand, the comments should be very clarifying. On the other hand, you may have a question about why or what I meant when I said a certain thing. First, the exam is due Saturday evening by 11:59 on October the 31st. Now, that is an absolute hard deadline. If you do not turn in your exam by that time, you will not have access to the Turnitin link to deposit your exam, right? This is a midterm. I have to do my best to guarantee that everyone is on an equal playing field in terms of the amount of time you all have. And the amount of time I've given you is specific. While I'm giving you a decent amount of time, this still is, in a sense, a time test in that it needs to be done in the days between now and the 31st, right? That's your obligation. If you have special needs, or if special needs arise in the form of life issues, you need to tell me about them ASAP if there's anything about what I'm asking of you is going to be a problem, right? If you send me a message at 11:58 saying, "Oh, Professor," on the night that it's due, "Oh, Professor, I had all these things, blah, 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 blah," that's not going to wash, right? You need to tell me when you've got the issue in advance, and then we can talk about doing some type of adjustment that's appropriate to your situation, right? And because this is my way of guaranteeing fairness to all students, that we have an even playing field to start out with. Okay, so some basic things. Please make sure your name is on the exam itself, upper left-hand corner, upper right-hand corner, with the class day and time indicated, you know, CMP 2800, and then whatever your class and daytime. Please use a Word document. This is really important. Do not give me some kind of WordPad document. I think not PDF, but a regular Word document, right? Because other formats cause different types of problems. Next thing, 12 font, 1.5 spaced, and the 1.5 spacing has to do with just it's convenient for me to view and read at a certain pace that I need to view and read it, but also it helps to specify the amount that you have to write. You're going to have 2 questions, and each question is going to demand a 2-page answer, 1.5 spaced. So if you've got different spacing, you're playing games with that two-page answer. Does it really have to be 2 pages? Well, the answer is yes. And it really shouldn't be any more than 2 pages. I'll come back to that in a second. But 2 questions, 2 pages each. That means 4 pages of writing. Not 4 pages of, you know, having the question there and so on and so forth, but 4 pages of writing, right? A total of 4 pages writing, even if they don't perfectly line up to the page, right? 4 pages. The idea of the 2 pages is, number one, these questions are complex and involved enough that if you're really working the way you should, you're going to need those 2 pages to say everything that needs to be said, number one. Number two, when I say 2 pages, it's a maximum limit that you need to write, but also you shouldn't be writing anymore. The flip side of it is, if you can't answer these questions in 2 pages, it means your answer is not focused enough. So part of the exam, as I've said, involves writing skills. And one skill of writing is saying everything that needs to be said that's appropriate, but also editing out anything that is not relevant to the answer. So this 2-page limit addresses those kinds of issues. And it is not enough to simply make factual statements about the text. It is not enough to make interesting observations or interpretations. The point is, these observations and interpretations have to be relevant to the question and its scope. And I'm going to talk more about that as we go. So the grading rubric, which is also more instructions or directions on how to do this. I'm looking for substance and writing quality, form and content. Substance of your answer deals with factual accuracy and the interpretations you make and the support for those claims. Support the interpretation is a claim through evidence and interpretation and reasoned conclusions from the text. So there are 2 main things you're doing when you answer these questions. In terms of substance, the questions combined factual matters and interpretive matters, right? So on the one hand, I'm going to ask you something that's going to demand that you know certain facts of the text. And if need be, you quote them or cite them directly, right? Then the focus of the question will become an interpretation based on your understanding of the text that's going to be supported by evidence from the text, right? Citation of the text, and also your own logical reasonings about what you're presenting me, right? So therefore, the substance of your answer involves both facts and interpretations, right? I go into this a little bit in the rules on the writing. Is there one correct answer for each of these questions? The answer is obviously not, because in many cases you can draw on different examples from the text. On the other hand, your answer interpretively has to stay within the framework of what's actually in the text, right? And the text is the limiting function of what your interpretation can be. Your interpretation can't can be more than one thing, but it's not going to be just anything. And we've talked a good bit about interpretation. It's got to fall within you could say the four corners of the text, right? If you make a claim that is contrary to some part of the text, like that interpretation is by definition invalid, right? But this test, apart from demonstrating that you're familiar with the text, is about your thinking, and the quality of your interpretation is based on your ability to support it, right? So I'm not looking for one interpretation, although things are going to fall within a set of parameters defined by the text. There are going to be different interpretations, but your interpretation has to fall within the boundaries of the text, and you have to properly support it through evidence from the text and your own reasoning. And of course, it's in your own reasoning and your own thinking about the text that you're going to say things that maybe I haven't even considered, right? So, and those are going to be valid so long as you can support and show, quality reasoning, logical consistency, and you haven't contradicted yourself or contradicted the text, or said something that's really not based in the text. So you can see pretty clearly what I'm looking for, right? Obviously, to support your answer, you're going to need to cite relevant passages. So if you look to the rules on the rules on writing, you're going to see some discussion of when to quote directly and when to paraphrase, and the functions of both of those. And I think it's just important to note that, your best evidence for supporting your answer is a direct verbatim quotation from the text. In some cases, that verbatim quotation will be self-evident. In other cases, it won't. In which case, when it's not, you need to explain what you've quoted. You need to explain what you have quoted. In other instances, you don't want to waste time in your two-page answer with quoting three paragraphs or four long sentences in a row, right? I need to see your thinking. I already know the text. I can refer to the text right there as I'm reading, right? And we're all familiar with the text. So that could be an instance in which you want to paraphrase, because in that case you just want to get to the key point of, say, those 3 or 4 sentences or paragraphs, and you don't want to just fill up space, right? So this is when I grade, I say, oh, this paragraph of quotation, this is just filler, right? Because this could have been boiled down into a paraphrase of 1 or 2 sentences, for example. And the key thing about paraphrasing, why it's so powerful, is that it shows your interpretive understanding, your discernment of the text. Whereas if you just present the text and say, there it is, it's not clear what you've understood and not understood because you haven't put it in your own words. So paraphrasing becomes very important. Writing quality. Writing quality. You must answer in complete sentence and paragraph form, right? There is no bullet points. There are no broken phrases, like taken from PowerPoints or some such. This is your writing written in sentence, paragraph form, right? And let me give a little insight here that the questions are quite involved, right? And you're going to need, as you write, to make reference to them. So what I suggest, and I'll mention this again in a moment, is that you use the questions to create a kind of outline to answer the question, and you use this as a tool to help you write, but at the end, I don't want the question interspersed into your answer. Your answer should be one continuous 2-page writing. And what I'd like you to do, and I'll say this again, is to put the full question at the beginning of your answer, but do not intersperse them one after another. Leave them distinct, right? But what I'm saying is, as a writing tool, to use that question as an outline, because obviously part of the success is answering every aspect of the question directly and fully. So a key thing that I'm looking at in terms of writing is your proofreading. And if you look at the rules of writing, I've given you some important points about the real function of proofreading. Proofreading is really not about spelling or grammar. It's really about assessing the meaning and intelligibility of what you've written, that it makes sense, and it makes sense to someone who's not you. And particularly that it exists, your writing has a structure that demonstrates a logical flow of ideas from one point to the next, one sentence to the next, one paragraph to the next. And that generally that's going to work. You're going to move from, each sentence represents a thought, and you're going to want to move from the general to the specific, from the general to the specific. And what I'm saying here is consistent with any notion of any professor teaching kind of basic expository writing, essay writing, and so on, right? But the key thing is you're going to be asked a question that's going to demand some facts, but ultimately an interpretation. So you're going to make that interpretation, and then you're going to, the general claim, your kind of thesis or hypothesis, and then you're going to support it with facts. You know, like, what is the meaning of the fruit? And you're going to say, the meaning of the fruit is X, Y, and Z. And then you're going to say, the meaning is this because da-da-da-da-da-da, so on and so forth. So proofreading really gets at these issues of, is what I'm saying make sense? And does it have a structure that's intelligible, right? That has, there should be a kind of necessity between each sentence from one to the next. And when once you feel that each sentence is coherent on its own, you have to see, is the whole paragraph of all those sentences combined together coherent? And then do the paragraphs together, do they make sense in the order that they are, right? And obviously in writing, you're going to be groping and searching for the answers. You're not going to have the full answer at first. You're only going to develop this answer as you write and think, because writing is really a process of thinking out loud or thinking on the page. So when you first start answering this question, you may not have a definitive understanding. Your understanding is going to develop as you write, which means you go back. Proofreading, of course, leads to revision and editing and so on and so forth. All right, so length is no proof of a good answer. Just because you've reached the 2-page limit doesn't mean that, you know, it's a successful answer. The key thing is scope. Scope defines the parameters of the topic of what you're writing about. And of course, the topic is going to be defined by the questions that I've asked of you. And there's a general statement about what the topic is, and then there's specific subsequent questions that are all related, and they all go in a certain order. One kind of builds off the next. So the answer to one question is not going to be the same as the next one, but the answer to the first question is going to help you enter into the thinking and logic of the next question, right? So scope defines two things. Everything that should be in what you've said, but also everything that should not be in what you've said. And the question itself is going to define what should be in those 2 pages and also what should not be, right? So as I've said, it's not enough to just say something pretty. It's not enough to say something that's even true about the text or even a really interesting, fanciful interpretation. The key is, are you speaking to the questions that have been asked of you, right? I have specific interest in knowing your thoughts on what I've actually asked of you. So you want to stay on topic. And staying within the scope is just another way of saying staying on topic. This is key, number 21. Under no circumstances should you be using any secondary sources, actually I should say, outside of the things that I have provided for you. Which is to say, where are you going to get this answer from? Where are you going to come up with it? Number 1, it starts with the text itself. Number 2, it extends to your own thinking about the text. Number 3, it involves class discussion. Number 4, it involves the materials I've given you, including PowerPoints, study guides, videos, and then also, if we think of Cass as really a secondary source, right? We read in relationship to Genesis, and I explicitly indicate that in providing your answer in the question that deals with Genesis, that you use Cass as a reference point to provide some substance for your answer. But beyond that, you should not be going onto the internet and cutting and pasting anything, number 1. Number 2, this is not a research paper, right? I am not asking you to go onto, let's say, the library website and go find articles interpreting Genesis or Job, right? Because I want to know your thinking. I'm interested in your thinking. And since this is not a research paper, this is a critical thinking paper alone. right? So recently, for some reason, I've been giving this format test for like years, and all of a sudden I see people like drawing on secondary sources. And in one sense, it's admirable, especially if you cite it properly and you don't plagiarize. But it's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for your thinking. Looking for your thinking. And obviously, this leads to issues of plagiarism. Plagiarism is when you rely on two or more words from another author and you do not properly cite that these are not your words. It's essentially stealing someone else's language, stealing someone else's intellectual property, and worse, presenting it as your own. And if anyone does that, you get a failing grade. So as you know, Turnitin compares all the tests and things like that. And also, I've just developed a good eye for language that is not of the author, meaning the student. And with the internet, if you cut and paste something, all I have to do is do the same thing to you. I cut and paste that little bit of text and I plug it into the magical Google search, and stuff comes up. And I'm pretty good at ferreting that stuff out and finding it on the internet. And one of the nice things is I can really show definitive. In the olden days, it was like hard always to definitively prove people are plagiarizing. But with the internet, like someone cuts and pastes something, it's very easy. And you know what I do? I say, this came from this website right here, blah, blah, blah. And I can give you the whole cold, hard evidence. So you don't want to do that. And the big thing is I don't want to read someone else's thoughts and writing. I want to read yours. Okay. So let's turn now to the questions themselves. So here is the exam. It's 100 points. The final exam will be 100 points. And I give you question 1, and then I tell you what the relevant readings are. It's a 2-page essay, so there's a lot of involvement here. And these readings in many ways are redundant because they all deal with the same themes. They just give you more input and point of view about them. So the first question is something we talked about extensively in class. Compare and contrast the story of the temptation and fall in Genesis with the myth of the ages and Prometheus's gift of fire and his subsequent punishment in the myth of Prometheus. So this is a compare and contrast question in which in each one of these letters I'm asking you to juxtapose these two writings. Some of these topics go together, which means on one way you could think of each of these letters as constituting its own separate paragraph, but in some cases maybe they could be combined. That's up to you. But I would prefer that you answer these questions in the order that they're presented. So compare and contrast first the myth of ages, or races as it's called, of mankind with the fall as visions of a historical process. That's something we asked about, something we in the reading response, and something we talked about in class. Issues of B, who transgresses and who is punished, and what's the significance of the fact that there's a distinction in these two stories between who transgresses and who's punished, and what does that mean for us human beings? Compare and contrast the meaning of the fruit and the fire. We talked about this at great length. And here's the key thing. I want you to clarify both the literal and the figurative meanings of these things. And we went at great pains in class to specify the exact meaning of the literal thing, right? Fire as a literal phenomena and the function it plays within that myth versus the literal fruit. Particularly in Milton, there's a great discussion on the smell and appeal, the visual, physical appeal of the thing, the literal properties of it. And then obviously, once you have those clarified, assessing their figurative or their symbolic or metaphorical meaning is more informed by that understanding of the literal meaning of it. Because symbolic meanings, while they transcend literal meanings, they're derived from them and rooted in them. And if you're not clear about the literal meaning of the thing, it's going to be harder to understand its symbolic meaning. Okay, so D, both of these things symbolize knowledge. I hope I'm not giving anything away there. Everybody should know that. But they're different types of knowledge, so I'm asking you to compare and contrast the two. And obviously some differences here are going to come up in the different emphasis you place on these different sources, right? I mean, you can't address all these sources in terms of fleshing out your answer, because you'd write forever and ever. But, I mean, you get an idea that you latch on to from one of the sources. Obviously, Prometheus myth is going to be consistent, but the other three that all deal with Genesis are giving you a broad range of emphases that you can choose from, right? So people are going to have some different thoughts on these things. Although there's a lot of consistency, right? I said that Milton, in many ways, is actually an interpretation of Genesis as much as it is a kind of recapitulation in expanded form of the story. In both stories, the thing gained by mankind through transgression has to do with reason, intelligence, knowledge, some kind of what is the moral of each story has to tell regarding the value of knowledge. So we see that the Bible has a certain relationship toward the faculty of human reason and toward the knowledge that's gained from it. And clearly these stories have morals about the value, the worth, maybe even the pitfalls of our faculty and our desire to know, our curiosity, our temptation. On one hand, we believe that human beings should use this faculty because they have it, and it's what distinguishes mankind. But also we know things like curiosity kills the cat. So there's some interesting commentary here about the value of our desire to know and the knowledge we attain in the whole scope of human life. Compare and contrast the consequences of the knowledge gained from each thing, right? So here's just a question about what are the consequences of this knowledge that's gained from the fruit versus the fire. That's pretty self-explanatory. In both cases, there is a prohibition, right? And these prohibitions are not identical. And this is a more open-ended question, less factual. What do you think of the prohibition, and what do you think it means, right? In each story there is a prohibition pertaining to the knowledge, right? Lastly, what is the significance that in Genesis it's mankind who acts to liberate itself from its condition of ignorance, where achieves this liberation under its own powers, whereas in the story of Prometheus, it is a god who helps mankind out as a result of his feelings of compassion, and you might even say of pity for the lowly condition of the humanoid beings that we see in the Iron Age. So question number 2 comes from the book of Job. The first question is worth 50 points. The second question is worth 50 points for a total of 100 points, right? So I just kind of preface these questions that are all related, right? They're all thematically related, and I've done my best to have a kind of logical flow from one question to the next that should help your thinking kind of build from one question to the next. So the book of Job is a story about a man of a certain type of character who suffers a great tragedy, and we get to see how he responds to it. In seeing his response, we get to see what kind of man he really is as his mettle is tested by this calamity. Job is a man of substance, quote unquote. But we discover there are two kinds of substance, and that who Job really is will determine which one he thinks is most important. So the first question is, explain in detail what these two types of substance are. And in essence, we've spoken of the use of this word literally versus figuratively. Because if you look at the text in verse 3, it speaks of substance in a literal way in reference to specific things, right? But then there is also a figurative meaning we've talked about to this that is a different kind of substance. So explain the two. What do these two types of substance have to do with human nature? So this division of substance actually has to do, my argument was, with a division of human labor. A division of human nature, right? In that the human being is not one thing, but it's actually two, and therefore there are two kinds of substance that are relevant to our needs, our desires, our wants, and what we value. And these two types of substance have to do with the different valuations we make and that are part of Job's conflict. These two ways of looking at the world, and which one of them seems to matter more, and why. Then how do these two types of substance relate to the distinction between the city of man and the city of God? So this division in human nature, leads to a division in these two types of substance. And these two types of substance are really summed up in what Augustine, Christian theologian, called the city of man and the city of God. So what is that all about? Job's conflict, in large part, is a conflict of loyalties, right? It's a conflict between these two, loyalty to these two forms of substance, or to these two cities, right? There's a conflict between these two cities, between love and faith in God, versus self-love, or love of oneself, in which the me, or what is me and what is mine, are not clearly distinguishable. So I gave you this lovely quote from William James talking about that, and we didn't read it verbatim in class, but we discussed it. For example, it's natural for a human being to love themselves, and that which they have, and this love appears to be in conflict with the love of God. Explain this conflict, right? And this is kind of some of the heart of the story. In relationship to self-love, and so this is really an extension of D, E, in relationship to self-love, what does Satan mean when he says, skin for skin, all that a man hath will he give for his life? Okay. Then, next question, Satan asks, does Job fear God for nothing? What does this question mean, and what is Satan implying about Job with this question? Right? So this is obviously a complicated question that he asks. There's many layers to it. But what I'd like you to try to do is simply explain the meaning of the question and relate it to his kind of hypothesis or thesis about what he thinks Job is really about. I mean, this whole story is really about what, as we said at the top here, what kind of guy is Job really, right? There's an appearance and reality, and then the question is, what is the relationship between the appearance and reality? There's an outer man and there's an inner man, right? Last part, G. Satan's remarks reveal he has a kind of thesis or hypothesis about who Job really is. So this is really, F and G really go together. This hypothesis appears to be a statement about what human beings are like in general. So what I'm claiming here is that his remark about Job, or his remarks about Job, are also kind of statements about human beings in general, and the character of Job is a kind of surrogate or microcosm from humanity at large, in the kind of tensions, the kind of being that we are, and the kind of tensions and problems or dilemmas we face as human beings. What is Satan's belief about Job, and is it true? Put another way, what kind of man is Job really, and how do we know this? How do we know this? Okay, so I think the big point here is you see how all these questions really fit together, and you need to touch on all these issues. And I think generally you should follow the structure, the order in which these questions have been asked, right? And I suggest that you use what I've given you here. You just cut and paste and use these to shape an outline so that you make sure to touch on all these issues, right? But in your final exam, number one, I'd like you to leave the questions in, but you leave the question in completely above the answer in its totality, and then when you give the answer, all you have there is your writing, your answer, without interspersed all the elements of these questions, right? So I'm saying use these questions as an outline for your writing process, but when it's complete, eliminate the outline and just have the question at the beginning. Okay, so let me conclude by just saying this, that the best answer is going to have a combination of the best, citing the best evidence from the text, and then, doing the best reasoning that you can do from your own understanding on what you think it means. But the real key thing here for everyone to keep in mind, because I see this as an issue generally when students take the test, is you must cite the text and try to pull out as much evidence from it as you can without simply giving me big chunks from the text to fill up space, right? So when you make a claim about the text, show me where it comes from. Indicate where it's come through some sort of citation that you think is appropriate. Other than that, I wish everybody luck, and obviously we'll have a chance to ask some questions long before the due date, and I shall conclude with that. So have a great day.